Okay, I think we're good there. Cool. Well, I guess I'll just get started. And anybody who comes in late will just have to catch the recording. So, yeah, first things first, let's talk about what we've got, the white paper. It's finally out, which is kind of surreal. I'm not going to lie. It's been a long time coming. And interesting to note that we didn't have a white paper for Malt V1 or V2. And the reason for that, ultimately, I think, is deep down, we kind of knew that the mechanism itself wasn't done. It didn't feel like we could present it to the world as being a completed thing, that here it is and it's working. There was parts of it that worked in Malt V1 and parts that obviously didn't, in terms of like the actual code, but also just the design. There was a lot of the design space within Malt V1 that just wasn't that good. But it was the seeds of a good idea. So we had just the auctions for the underpeg mechanism. And they're still here. They're still in the new version. So they stood the test of time. The above peg mechanism hasn't changed at all since Malt V1. That's just exactly as is, with the addition of the swing trader, but the mechanic is exactly the same. And the kind of big changes that happened from V1 to V2, it was the introduction of the swing trader, which again is still here. It's stood the test on that. But the V2 swing trader was pretty naive. It was a good idea, just like the auctions were a good idea in V1, but they weren't quite just finessed enough. And I think the same was true of the swing trader in V2. The idea was there, but as everybody is aware at this point, that big account that had like 3 million malt or something like that staked in V2, and their exit basically drained the protocol, which was very elucidating to us in terms of the way that the mechanism behaves. I think we got a bit unlucky because given that we launched the same day UST collapsed, but I'm not using that as an excuse because I think that the mechanism just wasn't good enough. It was getting there, but it just wasn't good enough. I think if we had launched the V2 mechanism at the same time that we launched the V1, so kind of where there was a lot more frenzy in the market, I think the V2 mechanism would have survived just fine. And I think over time we could have made the improvements to it that would have meant it was sustainable. But as things played out, that's not how it panned out. And again, I think we got lucky on that. I think the ability to reset has now put us in a position where we can actually write a white paper that explains the mechanism, and it kind of covers all the edges. And I'll get into some of what our thinking is in the white paper, because I appreciate for some it's going to be quite a dense read, the white paper, and we will be like rolling out better documentation, upgraded documentation that takes into account all of the new mechanisms and explains it a lot more simply than the white paper does, perhaps. But that'll come. But then also with Malt GPT, I think that becomes even more powerful because we have the ability for somebody to have a conversation with it, and I have big ideas for that as well. I think I would really love to roll out the Malt GPT as an open source project that all protocols can use, and end up building DeFi GPT almost, that is deeply knowledgeable of all DeFi protocols, just to onboard more people, because DeFi is complicated and it's difficult to understand some of the subtleties and the nuance. And unfortunately, much of the documentation and white papers are written by people who are designing these protocols, so the audience that they're communicating with is not generally the mass audience. It's the audience of other people like them who are builders and who understand this stuff. So we need to bridge that gap, and I'm hopeful that Malt GPT can be part of that journey and help DeFi just be more comprehensible to everyone. So that's a cool thing. But coming back to Malt, like the white paper, we can kind of talk about what's some of the ideas in there, and how they came to be, because I think that it's an important journey. Because I think perhaps people will look from the outside. I suspect nobody on this call, because everybody on this call is kind of like really gets what we're trying to do, and you're the true believers, right? So I'm kind of preaching to the choir to some degree here, but I have to acknowledge that there are many people who exist in DeFi who just have a passing understanding of what Malt is. Maybe they heard about it, and our reputation amongst those people is probably not great, and that's just a fact. Perhaps some respect that we're still building, perhaps some really appreciate the honesty that we've shown over time, but at the end of the day, the way that it looks from the outside is that we failed twice, and that's just the reality. I don't think we failed twice. I think we failed once, and then we had to make a difficult call to shut it down the second time. But I don't classify the second time as a failure, but many people will, and that's fine. And I actually kind of think that's a good thing overall. And that leads into this wider discussion of a common thing that comes up in the chat, which is why are we still launching on Polygon? And the reason for that is very much due to the reputational hit that we have taken in the broader DeFi thing. We have to get it right, is what it comes down to. We can't fail again. So we have to make sure that it's right. So the plan is to not launch on the Hype chain, so probably Arbitrum, because that's where everybody seems to want us to launch, and I would love to launch there because it's a cool ecosystem. But if we launch there and things hype, which I think Malt always has the potential to do, because it's one, stable coins, people like get frothy for them, but also you're getting paid initially in DAI, but ultimately in whatever coin you want based on us having a pool for it. So being able to like have a protocol that pays you X% yield in DAI, that's pretty special. And if that starts to work, it's going to hype, and I don't want that to happen in the same way that it did in V1, especially because then we run into situations where we have to perhaps struggle through with issues. Like, I don't think there's bugs, right? Like that, I'm going to be clear on that. If there are, it's like the real edge case, because we've run like 4 test nets on the new code base right now. It's been audited twice now, and we've also run a full simulation, and this is what, like, we'll release some articles about this, but we took all of the transactions from V1 and V2, and we built this simulation environment that allows us to replay everything that happened on Malt V1 and V2 in terms of user behavior, all the actual on-chain transactions, and run them across the V3 code base to see how things would fall when we do that. And we can then directly compare an apples to apples on the performance, and where, especially with V2, not so much on V1 because of the lack of kind of the more collateral, like the lack of the swing trader, but for V2 we can do an apples to apples comparison of how did it perform. And one thing we know about V2 is that when we paused it, the collateral at that point was about 74%, and we saw that the swing trader was drained, but I don't think we ever got over 80% collateral through the whole of the lifetime of V2. So that's a good benchmark to know. Okay, we had 80% collateral on V2, and we ended up like depleting the runway to 0. The swing trader got depleted to 0. We had a little bit of money in the liquidity extension, and then we had some auctions, but I think there wasn't much contribution before I paused it. So that's the benchmark. And then we ran all of that against V3 again and see how it came out. And the results were very promising. We ended up with, I think it was 100.3% collateral, 16 days of runway, bearing in mind that this is only just over 24 hours of activity that happened in V2. So to have 16 days of runway is pretty nice. And the APR that runway could sustain was 18%. So we could, at that point, the protocol was 24 hours old, and we can say we have 100% collateral, we're paying an 18% APR, and we can sustain that APR for 16 days. And the actual cash flow through the protocol at that point in time was about 35% in kind of a prorated APR. So we were pretty much doubling the requirement for the cash flow to sustain the APR, which in real terms means that the runway was growing. which is to be expected given that like the protocol's just launched, so the TVL is growing. But even then, the TVL shrunk quite a lot, over halved from top to bottom, I think, after the whale exited in V2. So we can confidently say that everything that happened in V2, including the whale exiting, V3 can just soak up and be absolutely fine. And another interesting thing to note, perhaps, and this gets into some of the stuff that we'll discuss about the white paper, is that the whale exiting in this simulation actually increased the collateral, which is really counterintuitive. But we started with, I think it was just over 99%, and then once that whale exited, we ended up with over 100%. And the reason for that is that the whale exiting took the price below the swing trader entry price, which guaranteed the, as we call it in the white paper, the collateral change inequality. And because of that, that means that simply buying malt at that price improves the collateral. And this is something that I think many people had the realization of through the USDC DPEG. Because many people were saying, well, why can't Circle just use a bunch of their reserves to buy back USDC at 90 cents on the open market? Because that would be filling the gap, right? They would be filling the hole by doing that. But they don't. They didn't. And that's really at the heart of the malt mechanism that we have now. And the white paper is just a way of rigorously defining a lot of those constraints. But ultimately, at the highest level, we can think about stablecoins in the way that they've existed up until now, as typically deciding on a constraint using the statement that the native token is worth $1. Right? The USDC makes that statement. Frax, USDT, like name all the other coins, right? And the kind of the big players in the stablecoin space. They all, internally in the protocol, implicitly assume, or explicitly assume, really, that the native token is always worth $1. And that statement applies a bunch of constraints onto the way that the stablecoin can function and the things that are even possible. And one of the major constraints that statement gives you is that the protocol can't profit from market price movements, because it's always valuing internally. It's always valuing the native token at $1, and that means that the market can do whatever it wants with the price, and the protocol can't make any profit because it has to hold on to the constraints that the token is worth $1. And I think like with custodial ones like USDC, there's legal reasons for that, that they have to do it that way. I'm not super familiar with what those are, but that's really why they can't just deploy that capital, right? And the question that we asked ourselves is and I want to be clear that this wasn't always our plan, right? We didn't know, like what's in the Malt White Paper right now is what we've learned over the last 2 years and building 3 versions of the protocol. We didn't start with this. We started with what seemed like a promising idea of kind of an iteration on the seigniorage stablecoin idea. But over time, we started to realize that there was other mechanisms that we can add, and we've ended up where we are. And then we realized just the kind of clouds parted almost, and we realized that we were just redefining some of the constraints that stablecoins have, and doing it differently to how major stablecoins do it. So instead of saying our native coin is always worth $1, and then the constraint that applies is the protocol can't make money on market fluctuations, instead we defined 2 inequalities in the white paper. One is the stablecoin's collateral change inequality, and the other is the auction malt burned inequality. And we make the statement that the protocol needs to adhere to those 2. Just like USDC makes the statement that 1 USDC is worth $1. The statement that we make is that the protocol has to adhere to those 2 inequalities. And just like USDC's statement of 1 token equals $1, that applies constraints onto what's possible. And same story with malt. With the 2 inequalities, we make the statement that these have to hold, and if they do, that applies a whole bunch of different constraints into what the protocol is even possible, like what the protocol is capable of doing. And that's something that we didn't have in V2. And that was the big thing that the swing trader was missing in V2, is the swing trader was just buying. There was a little bit of rule into how that worked, but generally speaking, the swing trader was dumb in V2, and it just indiscriminately bought. It didn't really matter whether the purchase was good for the protocol or not. It was just like, I can, and I'm going to do it. But then we defined these inequalities, specifically the collateral change inequality. And what that does is give us a framework with which we can make decisions. And that's what the entire white paper is about. And I think a lot of it will potentially look quite intimidating because it's a lot of math. But really, the math is just there to rigorously define what the constraints are. But the actual conceptual nature of what's going on is fairly simple. And all it's saying is that when the price of malt floats, the malt protocol will always value one malt at its intrinsic value based on its collateral value, right? Instead of saying it's always worth $1. So that means if it depegs from $1 and the collateral is currently, let's say, 90%, then malt is not valuing malt at $1, it's valuing it at 90 cents generally. And if the market price falls below 90 cents, it's going to fill its bags. It's just going to have a field day. It's just going to get real greedy and start buying up a bunch of malt. And if it's above that, it's not going to do that. It's not going to be as greedy. It's going to be a bit aggressive initially when it thinks that it can just like recover the peg. It'd be like, oh, I'll make an aggressive decision. This may not be profitable in a vacuum, but I'm going to take the risk. Just because it's early days, there's no reason to think that the DPEG is going to sustain itself. This might just be a transient whale has just sold and we're going to just bring it back to peg. But as soon as the protocol starts to see the signs that perhaps the health of the internal protocol is not so good, and maybe the economics is shifting and the market is reacting in whatever way that maybe creates a sustained DPEG, then the protocol will start to be a bit more conservative and stop indiscriminately using the swing trader like we did in V2, and instead start to tailor its behavior according to these inequalities, with the aim of eventually getting to a point where the protocol is guaranteeing all of them. And when it guarantees all of them, we have a protocol that should tend towards 100% collateral and above over time. Well, it's strictly actually it tends towards 100. Even if it's above, it will also start to tend back towards 100, but that's by the by. So that's basically it. Like, that's, in a nutshell, that's malt. But there's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, I haven't even touched on the auctions, but they're, I guess, somewhat familiar to the people here because you've obviously been in V1 and V2, but the mechanism is fundamentally the same. I go into more detail on the risk in the white paper, and we obviously have the early exit, but we had that in V2 as well, so there's not much new there. But the big kind of high-level overview of the white paper, just it comes down to we have these two inequalities, and these are not necessarily specific to malt, these two inequalities. And they're more of you can think of them like a framework by which you can judge the behavior of stablecoins generally. And if a stablecoin disobeys one or both of these inequalities, the stablecoin will fail. I think that's just true. That's not to say that simply holding these inequalities guarantees that the coin succeeds. That's definitely not true. But I think over time, the economics just will not work out if you don't sustain these inequalities. So they're general statements about stablecoins. They're not less specific to malt. But then the malt protocol is then a design that attempts to appease and hold these inequalities. But ultimately, like, I guess you can think about it conceptually. If there's a total supply of malt, let's just for the sake of example say there's 100 malt in existence and there's 100 DAI in collateral backing that. So we're 100% collateralized. Things all good. And then the price falls to 90 cents, or let's say for the sake of argument, let's say 50 cents because the math works out easier. And let's also assume we can execute at 50 cents. So, and we the protocol buys back, or let's actually say an arbitrageur buys it at 50 cents. And it's a traditional stable coin that does mint redeem like Frax, and buys it at 50 cents and then sells it back to the Frax for $1. So now the supply is reduced by 1. It was 100, it's now 99. And the collateral has also reduced by 1. It was 100 and it's now 99 because the protocol spent that $1. So the collateral ratio is still 100%. And that's how every stablecoin manages to exist and be sustainable, because the rate of change of the supply and the collateral are identical. The collateral shrinks by $1, the supply shrinks by $1. But then conversely, what if it wasn't the arbor that bought at 50 cents, it was the protocol? Now we have a supply that shrunk by 1 still, because 1 malt was bought off the market, but only 50 cents was spent by the protocol to do that. So now we have a situation where the supply and the collateral changed at different rates. So the total supply of malt is now 99, but the total collateral is 99.5. So there's more collateral than there is supply now. So somehow by buying malt at a lower price in a depeg situation, we were able to increase the collateral. As a ratio, the collateral as an absolute number dropped, but as a ratio of the supply, it went up. And there are like lines in the sand where if you're beyond the line, any decision you make will increase the collateral. If you purchase, if we're 100% collateralized, any purchase of malt that's under $1 is going to increase the collateral. That's just true. And that's fundamentally what the collateral change inequality is summing up. It's just saying that if malt's worth $1 and I get to buy it at a discount, I'll make profit. It's a super obvious idea. There's nothing radical about it at all. It's just that sometimes mathematical notation can look quite intimidating. But the core idea is very simple. We buy malt when it's cheap, we sell malt when it's expensive. And the math just defines what cheap and expensive mean. And that's it, basically. So I guess like I'll kind of pause there, because I obviously can rant a lot and ramble. So I'll open it up for some questions. There's obviously the AMA questions channel, so if you want to just type stuff in there, you can, or if you want to put your hand up and come up and talk, that's also fine. Just if you've got any questions about kind of what I've spoken about and the kind of high overview of the white paper, and then from there we can triage and go in different directions depending on what people want to hear more about. If they want to hear more about kind of digging into the mechanism, or more kind of future plans, or whatever you want, really. So I'll give you a few minutes to launch date. Yeah, I guess launch date. So I'll say this. I wanted to do this call in the Discord. I didn't even announce it on Twitter because I want to just like kind of speak to the people who've been with us, right? Like this is where we were born, on Discord, and everybody who kind of knows us in here. So everyone who's on the call is kind of like the OGs, our truest fans. So I wanted to do it here so that everybody gets to see it before we kind of open it up to various people who don't know what malt is. And those conversations will be a bit boring perhaps for you guys, because you know how malt works, and a lot of that's just going to be me explaining malt over and over again to people, because that's just how it's going to be. But for now, I'll say my plan is, and we'll announce this officially probably today, later, or tomorrow perhaps, but my plan is to launch on the 28th, which is 2 weeks from today. And I think that gives us enough time to kind of dot the I's and cross the T's before then, and we can just kind of get out into the world, because at this point it's like, I know it drags on for everybody, but I think for me especially, it's like this has been 2 years of my life and I still feel like I haven't got it out the door. But we're definitely there now. Like this is I feel like malt's what it is in the place it was always meant to be. It's not finished. There's still a lot to do. There's a lot of future plans to come, but in terms of the core mechanism, I think we finally got it. I think it's going to work. So yeah, I just want to get it out the door, and I'm sure everybody agrees. So there's no need to wait too much longer. So I think the 28th is the kind of tentative plan. And in terms of whitelist, we still haven't fully confirmed what's going on that, but we will when we announce the official launch date. But that's going to be probably everybody who was in V1 and V2 is absolutely going to get some allocation on the whitelist. Probably ballpark like 1 or 2K for everyone, and then open it up to like more for like other people. So I would say I'll screenshot everybody who's currently here, and if we do any kind of like extra for people, then everybody who's here will get that, because you guys are the best. So I'll just screenshot that now so that I have that. Okay. And yeah, and then yeah. So again, I guess to come back to the Polygon thing, we're in stealth mode still, fundamentally. Obviously, people know about us. Like we've become somewhat of a meme in stablecoin circles, and that's fine. People know who we are. I don't mind that. That's all fine. But I don't want to really actively push, as I say, going on to Arbitrum and really trying to push the narrative in case something goes wrong again. And that will just completely kill us, and I think that does a disservice to the idea. So while I want to get it out to the world, and I'm sure everybody else wants to see it in the world as well, we do have to be careful, because this is kind of our last shot to do it right. So we launch on Polygon. It kind of becomes a real money test net, for lack of a better kind of term, where we'll just make sure it works. And once we have that confidence, now we can really double down, knowing that we're not going to suddenly usher a bunch of people into a burning building, which is in some sense what happened in V1. Like a bunch of people just ran into a burning building, and obviously we didn't know it was going to burn, but that's just how it played out. So we're going to do that. We'll be on Polygon initially, make sure everything's working, then we can go on to everywhere, really. Like it's not just going to be Arbitrum, it's going to be everywhere, ultimately, because we need to be everywhere, because that's what a stablecoin is. That's what a stablecoin needs to do. So let's check out the questions. Thoughts on other stablecoin pairs besides DAI, as well as more volatile pairs like ETH BTC? Yeah, so that's kind of very top of mind for us at this point. Is there's still work to do on the non-stable pairs. That's the holy grail for us, though. Like if we can get to a point where we can be backed by ETH, and Bitcoin or whatever else, but ETH especially, that would be phenomenal. Especially given the way that Malt works with the kind of market-driven allocation of assets in the collateral, driven by the market participants who are staking or giving, like providing liquidity. The people providing liquidity are the ones who are choosing how the collateral is made up within the Malt protocol. And that's a pretty cool idea. And obviously in recent times, that's a very topical idea, because we're starting to see that people are noticing that we can't just survive with USDC and USDT and DAI. We need better options. And there's been some attempts at building truly decentralized protocols, but really none of them have succeeded in any big kind of way. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because it's a very hard problem, obviously. So, yeah, we can't roll that out immediately, but that's our goal, because that will really allow us to push a narrative that we are really decentralized. Right now, we can't do that because we're not. We initially roll out with DAI. It's like, cool, we're just like we're a synthetic DAI initially, and that's not what we want to be. But we will roll out more stablecoin pairs for sure. That's very, we're very sure we'll do that in fairly short order. The only thing that we need to figure out there is just like cross-pool arbing, but that's a lot easier to figure out than non-stable pairs, because that's like very real chance that the collateral just like falls by 20% one day. So there's a lot to think about on that. But yeah, we'll roll out other stablecoin pairs for sure. Frax, LUSD, USDC, whatever people want on other stable pairs, that's fine. And we can build up a good base of collateral in those, which is better than just DAI, but it's still not perfect. And then over time, we'll get to ETH and Bitcoin for sure. But there's some big hurdles there to get over. But we're working on them, and if I've proven anything about the Malt team over the last 2 years, it's that we're incessant. We don't stop. We may not have grown as fast as people want, but a lot of that is just because we just didn't have the money, right? Like, we didn't take VC funding. We could have, like, I was approached by VCs before we launched Malt V1, and I could have taken the VC money and grown quickly by hiring a team, and we could have blown up spectacularly, and that would have been amazing for people to witness the Malt V1 catastrophe, but also with a bunch of VC money. It would have been wonderful, and it was stressful enough for me without having to worry about VCs. But so it's been slow going for us because we don't have that kind of money, and like, I bootstrapped the whole thing. So it's like for that we're slow, or slower than perhaps others, but we're methodical and we don't stop. And that's our edge in the market. In a market that's so rapid and fast moving, people burn out really quickly. But we're trying to be here in 10 years. So we're going at a sustainable pace for us. And that pace will pick up as we do start to hire people, as we have more revenue and things like that. That we can afford to hire people, but that's not where we've been. And over the last year or so since V2, like, I've taken some time away, so that's slowed us down a lot, because we got to a point where we pretty much had run out of money completely. So I didn't have any to pay other people, and they all had to eat, obviously, so they have to go off and do their own things, and that's fine. I have to eat as well, so I'm off doing other things as well, and some of those things are really exciting and will very much impact Malt in the future. I can't speak to them right now, but I'm definitely starting to weasel my way into some circles that are going to be very, very high leverage for us in the future. So I see that as Malt work, even though it's not directly moving the needle on Malt right now, but it's providing a lot of leverage into the future. So I don't feel bad about that at all, but I did take some other time away because like, last year was pretty wild, and like, in all of crypto, and I was just like pretty burnt out from everything, from working, from like just trying to live through the crypto stuff that's happening and survive and still have some money in my account and not be completely rugged, just like everybody. But that takes its toll, and so, like, I'm going to own that slowed us down for sure, but we're still here, we're still going, and I think we're gonna do some good things. I think, like, this idea still has juice left in it, and we're gonna squeeze it until it's done. So Harry asks if I got it right, the main difference between V1 and V3, or V2 and V3, is that the swing trader has some extra logic to determine whether to buy Malt at a discount or not. How certain are you guys that this won't be exploited, or at least not as protocol ending? It's a good question. So the white paper doesn't really touch on this at all, because I see this as more of an implementation detail, and I didn't really want to put it into the white paper because it feels like it would just be adding complexity that's not that useful to the white paper. The white paper is more about, it's very academically focused, it just defines the theory of what would hypothetically be a protocol that could do well. But then the actual implementation that we have is an implementation of that theory, and much of that implementation is not mentioned in the theory because it's very specific to what's actually happening in the code, just to get the things to work. And one of those is related to kind of the exploitability of the swing trader, which is what your question is hinting at. And yeah, so we have two mechanisms, really. So there's kind of, well, let's start simple. So there's one place that the value can be extracted from the swing trader or from the protocol generally, which is when Malt is sold above peg. We don't really have anything to protect against that, other than the fact that the stabilization itself has to be triggered by an externally owned account. So it can't be flash loaned. It can be sandwiched, but it can't be flash loaned. So it is possible for somebody to sandwich it using just like regular transactions or using some kind of Flashbots infrastructure or whatever. In those cases, it is possible to sandwich. However, in those cases, the user has to have the malt. And that means that they have to purchase the malt at some point, or take a loan out to get the malt. But either way, when they sell it, it's gone, and the only way they get it back is to buy it back. And that gives the protocol an edge, because as you're buying it, we can be arbing it. So you actually accruing the malt that you need to arb or to sandwich malt later is going to be sandwiched itself, in a sense, by the protocol. So you're losing value there. So that makes it hard for the protocol to turn a profit. And down the line, the plan for that is that we ultimately have our own AMM. And the big reason, I mean, there's many, many reasons why I think we really need to have an AMM. And I think we're starting to see that as well within the wider DeFi ecosystem, that there's more protocols that are realizing that an AMM that controls the stablecoin is a good idea. And we're seeing that with Curve rolling out their stablecoin, and there's been other iterations on that. And I firmly believe that that's the case, that if the AMM controls the stablecoin, then there's a lot of really interesting things that can be done. And one of them in the context of this conversation is we can just have zero fees for the protocol. And that's massive edge, because that's, let's say, 30 basis points of edge just immediately, because the privileged position of the protocol. So if anybody's trying to arb us, like any kind of MEV bots trying to do things, they're starting at a 30 basis points disadvantage right from the get-go. Not to mention the disadvantage of having to get hold of the malt in the first place and not have an infinite supply of it like the protocol does, because it controls minting. So in that sense, I'm not worried about the swing trader above peg. But I also kind of feel like that's not what people are ever talking about when they talk about exploiting the swing trader. They're talking about below peg. And that is a much more nuanced conversation. Because if we did nothing and we just implemented the white paper verbatim, we would end up in a situation where the swing trader would just get absolutely destroyed, because it would just be a predictable, in fact, even worse than predictable, the MEV searcher could trigger the transaction themselves that does the swing trader action, and then the swing trader does this massive market buy, and the searcher can just sandwich it and extract all the value. And there are things inside the protocol that we implemented initially and are still there that are just slippage control for the swing trader, right? Like everyone knows, if you're gonna trade size, you want to have some kind of slippage protection. If you're not going through, like the best thing for an individual to do is go through a protected RPC or something like that, but protocol doesn't have that luxury always, because we have this open method that anybody can call. So we can't guarantee that that's going to be happening in any kind of trusted way or hidden way. So it's public, so we have to assume it's public, so it's sandwichable. So we have slippage protection. So that's the submission of the transaction has to, as you're submitting the stabilize, you have to like give the current market price externally, pass that in, and then that gets diffed against like the TWAPs internally. It gets pretty convoluted, but there are protections there to just make sure that there's no kind of drastic price manipulation, like a big sandwich or something like that, that's happening to the protocol. So there's that protection, but even that's still not quite enough, because it's not going to mitigate everything. We're going to be exploited or extracted. There's going to be some value extracted regardless. And I kind of think that that's going to be true regardless. I do think that there will be some novel MEV vectors that searchers will find that will allow them to extract some value from the protocol. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It would be better for that not to happen. If we could develop a system that the protocol gets all of it, that would be amazing. But I really don't think that's going to be possible. There's going to be some value on the table for searchers, and that's fine. And in many cases, that's actually preferable, because the searchers trying to do things to the protocol are going to put eyes on the protocol, like by people who understand deep EVM stuff. So there's probably going to be a lot of really good insight from them on how we can improve, but also getting to watch how searchers interact with the protocol. And we're going to build infrastructure that allows us to kind of monitor novel MEV vectors that are happening on Malt, because this will be a thing that people are going to try and exploit. And we can't be conceited and think that we absolutely found all of them. We spent a lot of time thinking about them, but there's things we could have missed. So we'll have infrastructure that's monitoring that stuff so that we can see when there's a novel MEV found, and if we can mitigate that, we'll do so. So that's another thing we have in place. But the kind of main piece to all of this is we have two core mechanisms. One is turned off by default, and it's kind of experimental. And I've spent some time speaking with some auditors and some MEV people about this mechanism, and the consensus is kind of mixed on whether it's going to work or if there's other ways to exploit it. So we've made it optional. We've turned it off by default. So the one that's on by default is that we turn off market buys when we depeg on the AMM. So the AMM, you can sell all you want when we depeg. So down to 90 cents and you're like, well, fuck this, I want to get out of malt. We're going to zero again. You're more than welcome to sell on the AMM. Just go ahead. But if you want to buy, you're going to get blocked in the default behavior of malt. And I don't like that. I'll be upfront about that. I don't like that that's a feature, and I would very much endeavoring to remove that from the protocol. But as of now, it's the only way that we can really guarantee that we're not going to get sandwiched aggressively on the swing trader, and it'll buy us some time to figure some things out. So when we depeg, the buying is turned off, and for everybody except the swing trader. So then you can... there's no way to sandwich it because you can't front run the purchase of the swing trader. Swing trader is just going to get free reign to do what it wants. But it does mean that the UX of the coin is a bit degraded when we depeg, and that has downstream ramifications to like people who need additional collateral for a loan that's collapsing or something like that. But I don't think those are going to be huge issues because I don't think we'll ever have a big depeg because we'll be close to 100% collateral pretty much straight away, and we'll continue to do so. So I'm not too worried about that, but it still has to be something that we're concerned about and thinking about. So that's where we have this kind of just complete shut off of the buying on the AMM, and that existed in V2 as well. That's not novel to V3. But the thing that's kind of novel is this kind of optional system which turns the swing trader into a two-step execution. The first step is the step that turns off the AMM, and then the second step is the swing trader executing, and they have to happen within like X number of blocks, let's say 5 blocks or 10 blocks. And if they aren't, if it's not triggered within 10 blocks, then the AMM automatically turns back on again after 10 blocks. So in that behavior, the degradation to the UX means that anybody can buy and sell malt all the time, except for this kind of 10 block window where the swing trader is getting triggered. And that massively improves the UX. Instead of turning off buying always, we only turn it off at the exact moment that the swing trader is going to do something. That does leave some money on the table for searchers who manage to front run the turning off of the AMM. But then there's limits on how much they can do that, because if the turn off is triggered when the price is too high, then nothing happens. So if the TWAP, if their purchase is like forced the price up and the real price is significantly above the TWAP and the price is above the kind of entry, then the swing trader is just going to be like, I don't need to turn off the price because the conditions are not even met for me to purchase yet. So there is a limit to how much that can be front run, and that's a concession I'm completely happy with. If the MEV searchers figure out how to extract some value from that, but the trade-off for the protocol is that the buying can be turned on for 99% of the time when we're below peg, even more than 99% time, then that's a trade-off that I'm willing to take. So I guess that's really it in a nutshell. That's a quick rundown of how we're thinking about the possible exploitation vectors on the swing trader, and it's certainly a very big problem that could manifest and absolutely would. And we saw this in V1, right? Like the auctions got aggressively front run or sandwiched in V1, and that's what planted the seed for a lot of this. Like we knew that would happen, but the extent to which it happened and the speed at which it happened was somewhat of a shock. And we know that that's going to happen aggressively, so these are the plans that we have. We know turning off stops it, because it stopped it in V1. The swing trader worked in V1, or not V2, sorry. The swing trader worked in V2 with the buying off. Like, buying gets turned off, swing trader triggers. The swing trader never got sandwiched in V2. It got, like, quote unquote exploited because of its indiscriminate purchasing, because it wasn't even looking at, like, it had no smart way of determining whether it should even purchase. And, like, if it was a human, if we just put, like, if we hired a human to do the job of the swing trader in V2, they wouldn't have made the choices that the swing trader actually made. Because when that whale starts to sell the first time and it drops the price, I don't know, to like 98 cents, and then the swing trader buys, that's fine. Human probably does that. It's like, yeah, cool, this guy exited, we're gonna buy back, bring it back to peg. When the guy sells again, maybe they buy again. But when it's like 3, 4, 5 times this guy is just selling large clips, the human's gonna be like, nah, I'm not gonna bother. I'm just gonna let this guy kind of get to the end of his clip before I do anything. And that's the kind of the smarts that the swing trader was lacking. And many people pointed that out, that there needs to be kind of a smarter execution in the swing trader. And that's pretty much the entirety of the time that we've spent working on the new iteration, was spent on thinking about just the swing trader mechanism and how that works, and then how that interplays with the auction. Because to kind of dig in more into Harry's comment here about the main difference between V2 and 3, yes, it's the swing trader, but we've removed the internal auction participation. That was the thing that was in V2, where if you were LP, the auction, if auctions triggered, you would automatically be participating in those with some of your LP, like rewards. Well, it's a separate pool of rewards that gets allocated to you as the protocol was progressing. So you have like your rewards bucket, which is withdrawable and vests to you, and then there was another bucket which is just there to participate in auctions. We completely removed that, so that's completely gone, and now all the money that was going to that is now being split between LPs and swing traders. So that was just like a kind of a factoring out of a feature that wasn't really adding that much, and redistributing of those funds. So that's great. That works. But the major thing is the order in which things trigger. So in V2, it was swing trader, then auctions, well, automatic auction participation, and then auctions. So it's this kind of waterfall cascade of capital, which meant that once you get to the auctions, all of the money was depleted, right? Like swing trader was dead. Automatic auction participation was gone. So we were basically run out of money, and then we're like turned it over to the community and be like, well, fuck you, bail us out now, please. We're done here, which is obviously not good. That was a huge criticism of that mechanism, and rightly so, because it was like not good. The risk profile of that was terrible. But I think we didn't fully understand the mechanism at that point. Like some of the nuances and ramifications of some of the constraints we weren't fully privy to, and this is what the white paper lays out. It's these that we realized that there are these constraints in play. They've always been in play. We just weren't aware of them. We figured them out now, and that gives us this framework to think about everything else internally to the protocol. And we've improved many things about the protocol through that lens of, now that we have these constraints, how does this behavior make sense? And does it even make sense in the context of these constraints? And one of the things was the risk profile of the auction was terrible. So now auctions trigger before the swing trader. Not all the time, so it's not a waterfall. But if the auction triggers, the swing trader is yet to trigger because it triggers at a lower price. So if the price continues to fall from here, then the swing trader will step in. And that's huge for the auction participants, because it means you can put capital into the auction knowing that if the price continues to fall, the swing trader's backing you up. And the swing trader's going to bring the price back up, which will give you a chance potentially to early exit if you think that the position's not good. So you can get out probably for a scratch at worst in a lot of cases. And in many cases, you probably be able to make some profit on the early exit. So that those are things that are really nice for the auctions, that people don't have to worry about these things going to zero. Like, there will always be a way for you to get out with less than 100% loss. And a big part of the reason for that is that we have a floor to the price of malt now, which is something that we didn't have ever before. V2 and V1, the guarantee that we could make about the price of malt was that it won't go below zero. That was it. That was the only guarantee that we could make. Even though V2 had collateral, it was indiscriminately buying, so it couldn't guarantee that it would have enough collateral to buy back the whole supply. V3 makes that statement. It can, but buy back the whole supply, because of the way that the swing trader enters, that it will eventually start to only ever buy malt at or below its intrinsic value, and at that point, whatever the intrinsic value is a guaranteed floor. Or it's a soft floor, though. The price can fall below it temporarily if somebody sells a huge clip, but the swing trader will always be able to bring the price back to that intrinsic value indefinitely, literally forever. It can buy back the entire supply at that level. So we can make that guarantee that if you purchase ARB tokens at let's say, and just to be clear here, there's two prices to worry about with the ARB tokens. One is the price that you paid per token, and the other is the AMM price at the time that you purchased. They both matter because to some degree, the ARB tokens is a wrapper, a synthetic around the swing trade back to peg. Like, you could buy, if the price has fallen down to 90 cents, you could buy it at 90 cents and speculate on the swing back to $1. But there's problems there, because one, you're going to get slipped at 90 cents, so you don't get a clean execution potentially. And then, excuse me, and then from there, you've got to also get out. So you've got to sell at $1. But other swing traders are going to be selling at $1, so you probably front run it and sell at 98 cents or something like that. So it's kind of messy. And then the slippage on the exit as well. So what Malt's saying is, all right, we'll manage a lot of that for you. We'll give you the exit. We'll suck up the slippage. You don't need to worry about the slippage, and we'll also make sure we get you out at a good price, above $1, at least $1, but probably above, ever so slightly. So now you've got a clean execution with no slippage on the swing, but then you also didn't pay the underlying AMM price of 90 cents for your ARB tokens. You paid some amount less than that, right? Because the auction starts at 90 cents and then progressively fell towards, let's say, 85 cents. And that was where the auction ended. So you've just paid 85 cents to take a clean zero slippage swing trade from 90 cents up to $1 with a clean execution. But you're getting this extra juice, which is this extra 5 cents. And that's the premium that is given to you for taking the risk of taking the trade, right? We're saying that, like, we don't want to just give you the swing. We want to juice it up because we want to incentivize you to do this. So we'll give you this extra juice, but we don't know what the juice should be, because how the hell can we price that risk dynamically for every single auction? It's impossible. We don't know what the macro environment is. We don't know what's happened, like, off chain. We don't know if weird things have happened to the team, or I don't know. There's all sorts of things the protocol just cannot know. So it doesn't make sense for the protocol to just hard code the risk, and that's what many kind of seigniorage coins did on the debt token idea. They just arbitrarily hard coded the risk with some metrics, and that was the end of that. The malt risk is market driven. The premium is market driven. That's what the Dutch auction is doing. It's saying the current market price is 90 cents, but like, at what price is this worth the swing? It might be 80 cents. We could wait for the AMM to fall to 80 cents, and the people who now think the risk to reward is good will take that trade. Or they could go through the Dutch auction, where the Dutch auction will just iterate through the prices really quickly and say, is 85 cents good for you? 80 cents. Oh, you're good with 80 cents. That's good risk to reward for you. Cool. Yeah, we'll lock it in now. We'll give you the 80 cents. We're almost settling a future for you in some sense. We're saying that you can get it for 80 cents. We'll sell you the malt right now for 80 cents, but we're not actually selling you the malt. We're selling you this kind of debt coupon that executes the swing trade for you with the premium. But that if the price falls, swing traders are backing you up behind. And so that if the current collateral is 85 cents and the current market price is 90 cents, and you now know that you cannot lose more unless you like actively do something stupid. But in kind of general market behavior, you're not going to lose more than 5 cents per ARB token because you bought it at a market price. AMM was at 90 cents and the floor on malt is 85. So you can only take 5 cents per malt loss. So all of these things, like the guaranteed price floor with the ability to early exit and the risk premium, all kind of tie into a package that looks pretty attractive, especially when compared to the V1 ARB auctions and the V2 ARB auctions. Both of them had very negatively skewed like tail risk, and that wasn't good. But the V3 mechanism is pretty nice. I think it's a pretty nice product to be like, obviously you don't have to. If you don't want to buy ARB tokens, that's fine, but if you do, we've kind of juiced it up a little bit for you, and we've structured it internally using this kind of malt burned inequality in a way that avoids a lot of the pitfalls that we've seen in other seigniorage coins. And if you like go back to earlier in this call where I mentioned that these inequalities that we've defined are just ways of providing a framework to analyze stablecoins, and the malt burned inequality is a tool that we can use to have a look at ESD or DSD as an example and why they failed, because they broke that inequality. Whenever the ESD, as an example, with their debt coupon, their whatever they called it, the bonds, you burned one ESD and you were given some amount of coupons, but the premium was arbitrary, and then those coupons redeemed later into ESD. But that means that the supply that was burned to generate the coupon was 1 ESD, but then to settle that, 1.5 ESD had to be produced in the future. So the amount of malt burned is less than the net growth in supply. So the supply grows when the ARB tokens are redeemed, or the bonds in ESD's case are redeemed. And that's not good, because the reason a depeg happens from a kind of Econ 101 perspective is the supply has grown to a point where the demand can't match it. So the supply is too large and the price has to depeg. That's Econ 101. So what we're saying with these mechanisms is, well, we have depegged because the supply is too large. So I'm going to propose a mechanism to recover the peg that grows the supply. It's like, of course that's not going to work. That just breaks all of economics. And the malt burned inequality is just that, right? It's just saying that if there is a symptom of a large supply causing a depeg, whatever we do, we shouldn't grow the supply to recover the peg. That's all that's saying. And it ties in with the other inequality because some of the capital is coming from the ARB auction participants. But the protocol has capital too. So if, let's say, an ARB token sells for 70 cents, that means 70 cents was contributed by the user. But let's say, to cover the value of the whole malt, that ultimately will need to be, so we're burning one malt now for the 70 cents, just to keep things simple. It's actually generally going to be more, or less than that, but we'll keep it simple. Then it's going to take one malt in the future to redeem that ARB token. So if it's 70 cents is coming from the user, there's a 30% gap, or a 30 cents gap that needs to be filled to guarantee that enough malt gets burned to cover the growth in the supply later. Because it takes one malt growth in the future to pay off one ARB token. So if we've just shrunk the supply by 0.75 malt to create the ARB token, then we need to burn a little bit more malt, 0.25 in this case, to get back to the one malt. And that's what the liquidity extension does. And that allows us to spend less collateral than we're burning, than the supply is changing. And that's the collateral change inequality. So we're saying that the protocol is spending 30 cents to burn one malt because the other 70 cents is coming from the user in the auction. So we can satisfy that inequality. So the collateral is doing good things in relation to the supply to increase this collateral ratio. But then also we're guaranteeing that we're burning more malt than we're producing ARB tokens, which keeps the economics tight of the whole ARB token cycle. And between the two of those things, the interplay means that there's nothing that the protocol does willingly, unless it's choosing to make the aggressive decision, which it does in the early stages. But it will generally, as the health starts to kind of level out, it will find a position where it will always satisfy those inequalities. And our conjecture is that that means that the protocol will increase in collateral over time. Obviously, there might be edge cases that we haven't considered, and in which case we'll figure them out and try to solve them. But from where I'm stood right now, I think we have a design that, in theory at least, is a stablecoin that can increase its collateral over time because of its relinquishing of the idea that one malt is always worth $1. So we're allowed to buy and sell malt for more and less, respectively, than its intrinsic value. And in doing so, we can profit from it. And that's it in a nutshell. I think that's everything. There's a lot of complexity in the code that exists just to implement those things, and we spent 2 years building that. But the core idea is very simple. It's just two rules. We make sure that if we're ever spending our collateral, we're spending less than we're burning the supply. And if we're ever making ARB tokens, we make sure that we burn more malts than we make ARB tokens. And if we do both of those, we're Gucci. And that's it. That's malt. So more questions here. So there's, isn't there going to be a scenario where if the collateral ratio gets below 100%, it'll aspire to a lower and lower floor, eventually landing to zero? Or is that a strict property of assuming malt? Yeah, so that's a great question. And that is, if we assume malt's $1, then yes, that's absolutely true. That will happen all the time. And this is where, in the white paper, there's another curve called the actual target curve. And that's how we stop this from happening. And the actual target curve is basically, in real terms, it's the actual peg of malt. We can say that malt is pegged to $1, but strictly malt is actually pegged to the actual price curve of malt, and that's a function of the malt to capital ratio in the swing trader. So as the swing trader buys malt back from the market, it now has more malt and less collateral inside of it, and the ratio of those two dictates all of these behaviors of the swing trader, like literally all of them, and that's how malt decides to get into trades. But then where it actually returns the market to. So it's like, one, we can say, cool, the prices drop below the swing trader entry price, we're going to buy. But then how much do we buy, and where do we leave the market price? And the answer to that is the actual price curve. And if malt's 100% collateralized, the malt actual price curve equals peg. And this is kind of really getting at an idea that I personally think is really cool. That I think, in some way, we've developed this mechanism where one of the ways it can work looks exactly like a traditional stablecoin. And that's when malt has 100% collateral. When it has 100% collateral, all of the complexity of the auctions, the swing trader entry curve, all of that stuff just disappears. It all just goes to one, which is the real peg of malt. And that's the swing trader will just buy because it's got 100% collateral. If the price is ever below $1, it's like, cool, yep, I'll take that, and it's going to buy just indiscriminately because it can literally buy back the whole supply because it has enough collateral. So it's just going to buy, and every time it buys, it only ever brings the price back to $1, and that means necessarily that the execution price that the swing trader received is less than $1. And as we've said, if we're paying less than $1 for something that we can afford to pay $1 for, we're making money. So the collateral ratio is increasing. So if we're at 100% collateral, we're just going to buy back malt. Malt's never going to depeg, and we're just chilling. Obviously excluding code risk. But assuming the code works, malt will never depeg. It will just continue to work when it's at 100%. So in that case, malt looks and functions and feels like a regular stablecoin. It just holds a hard peg, effectively, to $1. But the malt mechanism then generalizes further than that. Every other stablecoin just stops there. That's the behavior. Malt behavior has that as a feature, but it's just one of the ways it can behave. There's a whole other array of ways that it can behave when the collateral is less than 100%. So it's not that many stablecoins are built in a way that assumes 100% and guarantees it in many cases, like in the case of USDC or USDT, they guarantee, not getting into the kind of trust issues of like, are they actually solvent or whatever, but just like the mechanism itself guarantees it, right? They have dollars in a bank account and whatever. You can redeem them, you can mint them, and you're golden. But they don't have any way to function at less than 100% collateral. Malt does, and it can do so in a way that guarantees the floor. And this is where, as the price is falling, the price entry will dip below it. The swing trader buys back, and that buyback might be above intrinsic value. So in that case, that swing trader decision has just shrunk the collateral ratio slightly because we paid more than the intrinsic value. But the protocol's explicitly making those choices early on when the health of the protocol looks good. So we've never bought back any malt. So we're going to be like, yeah, sure, I'll pay a little bit over the odds for the value of malt because I'm just going to recover peg quickly. But now I've got a little bit of malt in my in the swing trader wallet, and I've still got a bunch of collateral. But that means that the malt to capital ratio has changed. So the next purchase that I make will be at a slightly lower price than it was before. Maybe it was 99 cents first time, maybe it's 97 cents the second time. And then maybe the price falls below 97, we buy back. We now have more. Let's say the actual intrinsic value of malt is 90 cents. So that 97 cents purchase, again, is going to drop the collateral ever so slightly. So maybe the collateral falls by a few basis points, the collateral ratio. But then we now have a bunch more malt in the swing trader. And the next time we're buying at 93. And again, we make that concession. We buy it at slightly worse price, or slightly worse than its intrinsic value. But every time it's been a slightly better price relative collateral. It's been lower every time. And then eventually we get to a point where we have more malt than the threshold value that we want inside the swing trader. And at that point, the swing trader will never buy above its intrinsic value. And whatever the collateral ratio is at that point is the guaranteed floor. But to get to the point of the question, if we're at peg with the 90% collateral and 0% malt in the swing trader, then the current collateral is not guaranteed to be the floor, but it will probably be around that. It's not going to be half of that. It's going to be some ballpark value around that, but probably slightly lower in practice. But as soon as we get to this point where the inflection point, which in the white paper is called the value of Z, that's the value that determines when this inflection happens, where the protocol goes from being really aggressive and willing to pay above the odds to being like, no, I'm just going to lock down and I'm only ever going to buy below, and I'm only going to bring it back to the collateral value, which guarantees my execution is below the collateral. And if we just do that, the protocol will guarantee that it will trend towards 100% collateral, because it's buying at 87 cents, bringing it back to 90. That's just increased the collateral a little bit. And then next time it buys at 88, brings it back to 90.01. And then buys at 88, brings it back to 90.05, etc., etc. And it's just creeping it up over time. And the kind of interesting thing that falls out of that is it's theoretically possible for malt to depeg, and then all that ever happens from that point forward is people sell malt. Nobody ever buys another malt, ever. People just sell malt because they're like, this is done, this is the worst idea ever, I'm just going to sell. And that's the only thing that happens. In that scenario, malt will find peg again, despite being at 90 cents and all that's happening is selling. It will recover peg back to $1. Like when I realized that actually genuinely blew my mind. I thought that was fucking incredible, to be quite honest, because that's super counterintuitive. That it's possible for only selling to recover the peg. And that comes down to people are selling, but they're selling below the intrinsic value. And anytime that happens, the malt protocol is directly capturing the difference because it's turning off buying, and then the swing trader arbs it. So it's like that value is entirely going into the pocket of the swing trader. So there's this mechanism where we're almost directly turning FUD and people leaving into protocol collateral to some degree. In practice, obviously, that's not going to happen. It's never going to be just selling. It's going to be buying. But that's how it works. But then again, as we launch, we're going to turn buying off under peg. So the only thing that can happen under peg is selling. So to some degree, we're kind of forcibly guaranteeing that we will eventually recover peg. But yeah, I think that's kind of a really interesting thing to see how that plays out in terms of a narrative, because I suspect, if I was to guess, what's going to happen is we're going to launch. People are going to be skeptical, as they should be. I would be too. Like, why would this team be trusted? They've failed twice. That's fair. But there's always going to be people who are going to ape just because it's a new thing. And there's going to be some people who catch on. They think it's cool, whatever. But it's probably going to be a pretty slow launch, is my guess. Then there will probably be flurries of FUD here and there just because, like, maybe things aren't working exactly right, or people misconfuse or misinterpret or whatever. And that'll last, I don't know, a few weeks. And then we'll probably get to a point where people start be like, well, actually, this thing's working. It's doing exactly what they say. And hopefully, by that point, the collateral's above 100%. Let's say just above 100%, like 100.5% or something like that. And if we get to that point, and we've been a few weeks or even a few months at PEG, the narrative's going to really shift away from this team failed twice to this is a team that kept building despite 2 failures, and now they've got a working thing. And that it's really hard to overestimate. It's really hard to overestimate how powerful that narrative is. So I'm hoping that we can use the kind of lull time to sort out a lot of things with like cross-pool ARB and roll out other stable pools. And by the time the narrative starts to kind of shift back in our favor, we're ready to launch on Arbitrum or wherever else we decide to at the time. And then we can kind of ride that wave of the movement of the narrative away from like this team failed and we've got to be skeptical to like, holy shit, this team kept building and they're still here and they just put their head down. It's like almost like what everybody wants in DeFi. Like everybody loves to meme the idea that bear markets for builders while just like shit posting. So I think like that is going to be on our side, but we obviously can't guarantee that. We can't rest on our laurels on that. But the thing that really, if I want to say anything to the people here that puts my mind at ease, so I hope it puts everybody else's at ease to some degree, is that I was nervous before Malt V1 and V2. Because deep down I knew that the guaranteed floor price was 0. There was something that could happen in the normal operation of the protocol where the price of the protocol goes to 0. That was just a fact of life for V1 and V2. And that really made me nervous. But I knew that was the case. And my plan, especially for V1, is I knew that this wasn't ready, but we're going to launch it and kind of move fast and break things kind of vibe, right? Like we need to get this out because it's testable, and then we'll hopefully bootstrap a ton of liquidity, and that'll buy us the time and the capital to be able to get it right. That was the V1 plan. Obviously that didn't materialize. V2 we were a lot more ready, but we still weren't quite ready, and I was still a little bit nervous. I felt like we had a really good shot at doing something good, but at the end of the day, there was still no floor price. And I spoke with a bunch of people before V2, and that was always the thing that came up amongst like the really smart people I was speaking to, is try and figure out if you can guarantee a floor, because that's really going to be the difference. If somebody knows I can only lose 10 cents here per coin, then it's a lot easier than being like, I can lose everything. So try figure that out. And we figured that out, and we have that now. So now I think I'm not nervous about this. I'm really excited about this launch because I'm very confident it's going to work. It may not work as well as I'd hoped, and it may not get the traction that I hoped, and these are all unknowns, but I think I could walk away from Malt and come back in 10 years and it would still be here. It will probably have no activity, because why would the coin just like kind of become something big on its own? But it won't have depegged to 0. It will still be living life. And I would be confident it'd be at $1 actually, because it's very likely that people would just be fed up and sell, because they're like, fucking dev disappeared 5 years ago. I'm just going to sell this thing. So that would be the scenario where all we see is selling, and despite that, the coin recovers. So I think that's all of that stuff's on our side. Ultimately, we're going to have to fight some battles. There's going to be some FUD. We're going to be compared to different stable coins. We're going to have like the history drug up a lot and said like, well, we failed twice. How can we be sure you're not going to fail again? And etc. etc. These are all things we're going to have to fight. And even like recently, there was a guy in the Discord popping up and just like had obviously not read the white paper and was just spewing, this looks like Tomb or this looks like ESD or whatever, and you can't make perpetual motion machines. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, I know. But I would like people to come in and ask questions with like an earnest honesty rather than just spewing that we're going to fail or whatever. But that's what we're going to have to fight, right? Those are the things that I'll have to answer those questions, and I'm completely fine with that. That's my job. And but either way, I'm very confident that we're gonna do something. If you've any more questions? We've been going on for quite a while now, but if you have more questions, I'm happy to stay on and chat more or explain more stuff if there's stuff that you haven't. But yeah, I guess if that's it, if nobody has any more questions, we can wrap it up there. And I'll probably do another one of these on Twitter later in the week, probably on Friday, where we can kind of get the wider world into it rather than just be the Discord. But I just wanted to get the ball rolling with the people in here because you're the real G's. Cool. Hope everyone has a good rest of their week and look forward to seeing more of you in the Discord and speaking more with you and just hanging out and kind of building something cool together.